All right, so looking at Act 1, Scene 4 for 6th hour. I'm not here today, which is no big deal. I will still read my parts, and I'll just pause in between so that you can use them, or so that you can use everything. Just have one person play the video with the volume up. I'll pause or have them pause whenever appropriate. I'm going to also try to be on the Google Meet, but I may not always be able to be present and available. You also will have DGP Tuesday recorded for you, so that there's no hang up or hiccups there for you. Okay, I'll just upload that and you'll be able to use it. All right. Looking at Act 1, Scene 4. The last time we were reading, our main characters were still trying to kind of sort everything out between each other. We did get a new character in Mr. Dussel. Mr. Dussel and Anne automatically started to have conflicts. Anne was having conflicts with quite a few people. Mrs. Van Daan, Mr. Van Daan, some conflicts with her mother. She also was conflicting a little bit with Peter in more of a flirtatious kind of way, but still some struggles in between. Okay, so looking at Scene 4, it says, "It is the middle of the night, several months later. The stage is dark, except for a little girl which comes through the skylight. I'm sorry, a little light which comes through the skylight in Peter's room. Everyone is in bed. Mr. and Mrs. Frank lie on the couch in the main room, which has been pulled out to serve as a makeshift double bed. Margot is sleeping on a mattress on the floor in the main room behind a curtain stretched across for privacy. The others are all in their accustomed rooms. From outside, we hear two drunken soldiers singing Lily Marlene. A girl's high giggle is heard. The sound of running feet is heard coming closer and then fading in the distance. Throughout the scene, there is this distant sound of airplanes passing overhead. A match suddenly flares up in the attic. We dimly see Mr. Van Dam. He is getting his bearings. He comes quickly down the stairs and goes to the cupboard where the food is stored. Again, the match flares up and is as quickly blown out. The dim figure is seen to steal back up the stairs. There is quiet for a second or two, broken only by the sound of airplanes and running feet on the street below. Suddenly, out of the silence and the dark, we hear Anne scream. Anne screaming. She moans, tossing and crying in her sleep. The other people wake, terrified. Dussel sits up in bed, furious. Anne still in her nightmare. She screams and screams. Dussel gets out of bed, going to her, trying to wake her. In the main room, Mrs. Frank grabs a shawl and pulls it around her. She rushes into Anne, taking her in her arms. Mr. Frank hurriedly gets up, putting on his overcoat. Margot sits up. Terrified, Peter's lights go on in his room. Mrs. Frank to Anne in her room. Over her shoulder to Dussel. Back to Anne. Dussel turns on the light in the bedroom. Mrs. Frank holds Anne in her arms. Gradually, Anne comes out of her nightmare. Still trembling with horror, Mr. Frank comes into the room and goes quickly to the window, looking out to be sure that no one outside had heard Anne's screams. Mrs. Frank holds Anne, talking softly to her. In the main room, Margot stands on a chair, turning on the center hanging lamp. A light goes on in the Van Dan's room overhead. Peter puts his robe on, coming out of his room. Dussel to Mrs. Frank, blowing his nose. Margot comes to Anne's room, followed by Peter. Mr. Frank goes to them, indicating that everything is all right. Peter takes Margot back. Mrs. Frank to Anne. To Dussel. Dussel picking up a book and a pillow. He stalks out. Mr. Van Daan, in underwear and trousers, comes down the stairs. Mr. Van Daan to Dussel. He goes into the bathroom. Mr. Van Daan goes back up the stairs. Mr. Frank, in the main room, sends Peter back to his own bedroom. Peter goes back to his room. Mr. Frank follows him, turning out the light and looking out the window. Then he goes back to the main room and gets up on a chair, turning out the center hanging lamp. Mrs. Frank to Anne. Anne shakes her head. She brings a stool over, sitting there. She leans down to kiss Anne. Anne throws her arm over her face, turning away. Mrs. Frank, hiding her hurt, kisses Anne's arms. Mrs. Frank, after a second. She hurries out into the other room. Mr. Frank comes to her as she comes in. Now, the rest of this is in German, so it's down here. And Mrs. Frank says, she's asking for you. Okay. Then up here it says, sensing her hurt, Edith, dear, look. If you go back up, it's Mrs. Frank again in German. It says, it's all right. I thank dear God that at least she turns to you when she needs comfort. Go in, Otto. She's hysterical with fear. Mr. Frank hesitates, and she says, go, dear. He looks at her for a second and then goes to get a cup of water for Anne. Mrs. Frank sinks down on her bed, her face in her hands, trying to keep from sobbing aloud. Margot comes over to her, putting her arms around her. She smooths the bed for Mrs. Frank and sits beside her a moment as Mrs. Frank lies down in Anne's room. Mr. Frank comes in, sitting down by Anne. Anne flings her arms around him, clinging to him. In the distance, we hear the sound of ack-ack. So again, machine gun fire. She takes it and drinks the water. In the main room, Margot turns out the light and goes back to her bed. Mrs. Frank to Anne. If you still need more time to finish what you guys were reading, you can pause me. I'll start off where she is asleep here in just 1 second. She is asleep. Mr. Frank watches her for a moment and then turns off the light and starts out. The lights dim out. The curtain falls on the scene. Anne's voice is heard dimly at first and then with growing strength. So I think it's safe to say that Anne is struggling with being in the attic, to say the very least. She's also struggling with just being a teenager. I'm sure some of you can relate to the fact that she says that there's two sides to her, the mean Anne and the nice Anne. And she's not sure which one's going to come out or how she's going to react. She tries to control one, but then the other one just comes out, almost as if her hormones, her emotions, everything else is taking control rather than just herself. Okay. Very normal for a teenager to deal with, but imagine, again, maybe some of you can relate to this with being in quarantine, but imagine being in hiding and not being able to be a normal teenager except in a small little apartment above a warehouse where you're not allowed to move, making much noise during the day, and you're only allowed to do things at night. And there's a war raging around you, and the fear of death, and the fear of everything. Okay. So, if you have any other questions, any other concerns, please make sure you ask. You do have Act 1, Scene 4's activity guide to do. Make sure that you're giving age responses where appropriate. Other than that, have good days, be good people. If not, fake it.